So greetings, everyone, and welcome to another installment of City Lights Live, the virtual expression of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and as always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take this moment in acknowledgement of those who came before us as stewards of the land. Tonight, City Lights is delighted to be hosting Sarah Chihaya discussing her exceptional new book. It's called Bibliophobia, a Memoir. It is an engrossing meditation on the way that books can touch us down to our core. She explores what she calls those life ruiners, books that can seduce us, that possess the ability to unsettle our belief systems, books that are revelatory and provoke us. Bibliophobia is at once an emotionally searing, erudite, and darkly humorous foray into an author's personal journey as told through books. For those of us enmeshed in the literary life, for those of us with a love of books, or even those of us on journeys of self-transformation, Bibliophobia offers us an enlightening meditation upon the role of books in our lives. So, Sarah is a book critic, essayist, and editor. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, The Nation, New York Magazine, amongst other places. She is the co-author of the Ferranti Letters, an experiment in collective criticism. She has taught at Princeton University, New York University, and UC Berkeley. She is currently a contributing editor at the Los Angeles Review of Books and makes her home in Brooklyn. Joining her this evening in conversation is Andrea Long Chu. Andrea Long Chu is an essayist and critic at New York Magazine. She received the Pulitzer Prize in Criticism for her work in 2023. She has also written for such magazines and journals as The New Yorker, The New York Times, Book Forum, and N+1. Her work has been reprinted in Best American Series. Her book, Females, was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in 2019, and a second edition with a new afterword, which is a very, very lovely edition indeed, is going to be published this coming March. And her essay collection titled Authority is being published in April from Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Sarah Chihaya and Andrea Long Chu. Welcome to you both. Such a pleasure to have you at City Lights.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. That was wonderful. Thank you, City Lights. I'm very happy to be here. Sorry, my Zoom, I can't see myself, but I'm assuming that you can all see me because my Zoom is not working. I, having lived in the Bay Area, love City Lights very much, and I'm really delighted and honored to be doing this event. I was up late last night, sort of feeling nervous about this, and I was thinking I still have an old City Lights bag that I carried around for, like a tote bag that I carried around for all of college. I wore through the first one and then had to get a second one because I loved it so much. So City Lights is a place that has meant a lot to me in my life. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having us, for showing up virtually. If for some reason you can only hear us, I'm Andrea, and that was Sarah. It's wonderful to be on Zoom together. As I was remembering with Sarah earlier, Sarah and I met in person, but we really got to know each other over Zoom during the pandemic. So for us, this is sort of, for me anyway, it's sort of a nostalgic thing to see her nodding along somewhere, not very far away, but yet over the internet. So we decided that we're just gonna, there's so much that I'm interested in talking about. We're just gonna like barrel in and not do any reading. So I'm just gonna go. How does that sound?
That sounds great. Just go for it.
Great.
Oh, first I'd like to say you can pre-order Authority. And hopefully the link will go up there somewhere. That was just to give a little boost to Authority. It's available for pre-order now. Okay.
Well, that is very sweet. So the place that I wanted to start was with the title, Bibliophobia. It comes up relatively early that you mean something more complicated than just fear of books. There is like a sense of a more generalized kind of ambivalence or anxiety towards books, that actually comes from having a deep attachment to them a lot. And so I was thinking about that, the sort of way that bibliophobia and bibliophilia, as you put it, are kind of like always kind of existing in tandem with each other. And then I was looking at the epigraph to the book, which is from A.S. by Its Possession, which is one of the Life Roner books that you talk about. And it is, "Oh, love is terrible. It is a wrecker." And it struck me as I was reading it yesterday, rereading the book, that even though it is from a book, like most epigraphs, it is not actually about books at all. And it made me think, oh, actually, it's like, this is a book about being afraid of books and loving books. It is also just a book about love, like, period. So it is sort of also like, it's about love, and it's about generalized anxiety provoked by love. So it's also sort of like filiophobia. And the thing I wanted to kind of start with was like, how do you see not just the question of like loving books, but the way that books in particular kind of can stand for love in all of its kind of in all of its thrilling and horrifying and tedious and all of those other things, all of those ways.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think that there are a couple of different answers to that. Part of it, for me, is that because I think about books the way I think about books and so much, and it's the way that I've always sort of understood how to relate to myself and how to relate to people. I think that love and fear and books and people have always been wrapped up in the same thing. We get our ideas about people from the people we meet, but especially when we're like younger and haven't met a lot of people outside our families or outside of our friend group, we learn about people through books. We imagine the sort of people that might be in the world. And books are a huge part of like just conceiving of what that might mean, and also conceiving of how you might relate to those people. Like, I think a lot of, examples, there's so many books about characters who confuse themselves for heroes and heroines of books because they think they should live life that way, right? The novel as instruction, the novel as like a way to live life. And I think that even if you don't believe that, like Emma Bovary does, you still could believe it in a kind of magical way. Like even if in a way you don't admit to yourself, you're always looking to books to tell you something about how to live, right? And how to read and how to live, to me, are very tied up in each other. And I think I've at various points in my life, I've sort of made the mistake of thinking that you could live life, you could read a life like you're reading a book, or you could read people like you're reading a book, which I think is, flawed, like very unfair to people in some ways, but irresistible also.
Well, and that actually points to like a kind of maybe like inverted sense of bibliophobia, which is, if bibliophobia is like, oh my God, it's a book. Like there's also a sense in which like, oh my God, what if this isn't a book? Where like something that whatever the kind of safety or the structure or the familiarity of like the book stops being there, and then you have to deal with what is left over.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one books can do obviously many things, but one of the things they do, especially when we're younger, is that they're kind of rehearsal space. You sort of imagine how people will react to certain things. You see things play out. You even if you don't put yourself, in that place, like I have various problems with identification that I write about in the book, but I think all of us learned some cues, like from those rehearsals, from seeing the different ways that people can be, the different relationships they can have to each other. They, whether we realize it or not, they're always sort of giving us ideas or making us think about ideas relating to like how we will be in the world and how we will have those relationships.
Yeah, I am reminded as you're saying, you're talking about young people, and this is all prefatory to a question about young people I want to ask. But I'm reminded in what you're saying of the moment in the book when this is the chapter where you introduce the idea of a life ruiner, of a book that kind of ruins books for you, forces, makes you want to have this kind of experience that you can't repeat. But in that chapter, which is about Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, I think near the end, are like physically looking at your copy from high school, I guess, and like looking at, your like gel pen, whatever, like notes.
Terrible annotations.
Well,
Foreshadowing.
there's like
Foreshadowing.
there's multiple levels of identification and disidentification happening, because there's like you seeing little Sarah trying to relate to the book, and then you as an adult still very much relating to the book in certain ways, even though you feel ambivalent about it. And then this question of whether or not you identify with the girl who's doing the writing.
Yeah, I mean, definitely that was it was a surprise to find these annotations because I hadn't remembered making them, which again, I guess answers your question sort of. It suggests that there's such a disjunct between like my younger self and my older self reading the book, where Morrison is still what we have in common, but it's like Morrison is this kind of meeting ground between like, the old me and the young me. And it's so funny because I remember when I was writing that chapter, I was reading Vivian Gornick's book about rereading, and she's talking about the very same scene, like her encountering her old books and encountering her old self and like reading her annotations. And she says that she felt like an archaeologist, like poring over these annotations and remembering things and feeling closer to that younger version of herself. And it's like it's very touching and sort of very moving, and she describes the scene. And I was reading that and thinking, well, that's not how I feel. Am I doing it wrong? I actually felt quite far from myself. Like I felt, reading Bluest Eye again, and I hadn't read it for like many years because this book affected me so strongly. Reading it a second time and then meeting myself there, I didn't recognize the adolescent I was. And I mean, it was interesting because it made me think about how far from that person I've come. And where we were interested in some of the same things, but it was sort of like seeing another character intruding in, who'd been inserted into this book that I did not know how to relate to because she was not actually part of, Morrison's conception of the book. She's not part of the architecture of the book, but she was there anyway, and she felt very far from me, but obviously she felt some kind of connection to the book that was the same in some ways, but different also from whatever I was feeling and rereading it. It was a really sort of alienating experience. But it was interesting. It was like it's very interesting to, meet yourself where you don't expect to do so. You don't expect to find these traces in the past.
Yeah, and she's there to sort of like intercept you almost, that like you don't actually get to look at the book, or at least that copy of the book, without her being in a way that's sort of, like she's what the thing about writing in a book is that like everything in a book is just written in a book, and there is a weird kind of like hubris to being like, I'm also going to write in the book, and now this book will be mostly written by Toni Morrison and slightly written by me. But it is actually true. Like it all becomes, especially over time, it all becomes part of the same like text. But okay, so the thing I wanted to ask you about your younger self, our younger selves, you and I have talked about how this question of like whether a life ruiner can be something you read when you were very young, or whether it can be like meant for young people, as opposed to being sort of more classic works of literature or semi-classic or whatever. And I was rereading, and the very beginning of the Toni Morrison essay, there is a little scene of you, I think like coming up with a deck of attributes so that you could basically rank.
Make a character sheet.
Exactly. So you could roll characters, essentially, make characters that sort of conformed in the sort of nice, kind of bland, predictable way to these, as you say, anonymous fantasies that you're reading. The phrases are, it's like, I wrote these down. It was like anonymous or predictable, never by name. I know some of them because you and I know each other, but never by name. They're just anonymous fantasies. Reading those, having an experience of wanting to be immersed in those worlds, so much so that you would spend all of this time, you know, making all this stuff up and writing it down. And then having a moment, couple pages later, where you read The Bluest Eye, and suddenly like ostensibly a different kind of literary experience kind of opens up, and we sort of move in that direction. And because it's near the beginning of the book, we're also just moving, we are sort of like growing up and like putting away childish things, even if young Sarah's interpretation of The Bluest Eye was not particularly mature. We still have this sense of growing up. And so I was also thinking about, like, I don't know, bibliophobia in the sense of being afraid of something being the wrong book, or of being like not the book that you would like other people to think it would be. I was sort of feeling for the anonymous fantasies. And I mean, like, that to me is very, like, I would love to know more about, not necessarily the content of them, but just like kind of, I don't know, what kind of relationship you think is involved in that kind of motion away from these like childhood books that we read and they teach us to love reading, and then we abandon them. You know, the way that you're like, this is the boyfriend that taught me how to be a good girlfriend, and now I shall leave him and find a superior boyfriend. Yeah.
I think, first of all, I will say that, life runner, it's a sort of tongue-in-cheek term, because I'm saying this not to you, Andrea, but just to the public who have not read the book. Like, it can sound really bad, but it's a good kind of bad, right? It's like a necessary step in one's personal evolution. And whenever I describe it to people, I describe it as something that the kind of book that makes you want to keep reading, or the kind of book that makes you hope that someday you'll find another one like it. So it's the beginning rather than the end of a quest. It's like something that makes you want to keep going. And I think that can be anything. I think that more important than the content of the book is the experience you have reading it. Like, it could have been, if I was someone else, I'm sure there are lots of people, perhaps yourself included, for whom the fantasies were, there is one of those books that would have been the life runner. Like, I'm not here to judge anyone's favorites. Like, I think that I am just happy to hear that people have had the experience with books, and like whatever they are, if it's a book that makes you see things differently, it's not like a quality of literary experience necessarily, or quality of of literature itself. It's not like, I went to grad school and I only think that you should have your life ruined by Toni Morrison. No, I think that, you can have your life ruined by anything. You can have I've had lots of people say like Matilda or like, or any of these books we read very early on. It just depends. I think if anything, I was like kind of a late bloomer and like didn't come to this kind of experience until uh high school, till I read the Morrison. But it and looking back, I see that in some of those books that I read before I met Morrison, I was having experiences that were life-changing. I just didn't realize it until very late. Like my partner and I are reading The One Streeter King again before bed, and it's really nice. I highly well, you also do some reading before bed, so I recommend this. It's very soothing. But we've been reading out loud before bed, and I had forgotten how beautiful it is. And I think that like when I was younger, I read it for the first time when I was, who knows, like, I don't know, 9 or 10. And I didn't know how beautiful it was because at that time, I was just used to reading the story. And that book has enough story, right? There's always something going on. There's like, um, because it's a version of Mallory, this version of medieval romance. There's always some like wacky night hijinks going on, or something very sad, or something in between. And looking back on it now, I see that I must have identified something in it that was beautiful and sort of unsettling sometimes and all these things, but I couldn't put together yet. They were all these earlier books were giving me some tools, like different tools at different times to meet Morrison when I met Morrison, to read Bluest when I read it later in life. But I just didn't know that they were happening. And yet, like another book that you've heard me talk about many times that I think did something to me that I didn't understand was The Darkest Rising by Susan Cooper, which I still reread it every year. I read it every year at Christmas because it's like a great midwinter book, and it's haunting and beautiful and wonderful. And it's magical. It like casts a sort of spell. And I think that even when I read it the first time, like when I was very young, I knew that there's something magical about it, but it didn't ruin my life yet because I didn't have enough life to ruin, if that makes sense. Like it only taught me that books might be magic. They might be doing something, they might be casting a spell, but they were not, but it didn't devastate me. It didn't make me look at the world differently the way that the Bluest Eye made me look at the world around me and myself and others around me differently.
Yeah, I mean, it's what this is making me think now is like, so I think you just said, very democratically, you said you can have your life ruined by anything, which a big agree. But it did make me think that not the narrator of the book, but the Sarah Chihaya character, essentially, that is moving through her life, that we see her growing up and having these experiences, and that it's actually very not true for her, that a sense that there are appropriate kinds of experiences that are kind of rarefied or like dignified, or just the way that they ought to be, usually that other people are having, and then that there are sort of like bad, half-baked, vague, fuzzy experiences that you can have that don't really amount to everything that usually the Sarah character is having. That is like that kind of tension is really there, like strung through the whole book. And so in that sense, the desire to have the desire to, to have a life that could have been written by Toni Morrison, as opposed to the desire to have a life that could have been written by the Dragonlance people. Like there is still, right, an aspiration to a kind of literarity that is what gets her in trouble a lot in the book, or what keeps her from allowing herself to, like, give reality to these feelings she's having. Right? I wish my depression were like in a better genre. In other words, so it's a genre question.
Yeah. Oh, I will say that I, Sarah Chihaya, do aspire to having a life written by Tracy Hickman or Weiss of Dragonlance fame. I would really like that. Um, but no, I think well, you knew that already. I think you're right, though. I think that there a lot of this book, and I realized that when I myself reread it, like after it, I hadn't looked at it for a while, but then when it came back in its finished copy form, I was like, well, I guess I should read my book again. When I read it again, it like really struck me that a lot of it is about imposter syndrome. And, it's some part of me is still that the teenager reading the Bluest, and some part of me is still like a first-year grad student thinking that everyone has read uh what my advisor called a folder full of philosophers whose names start with H, who I still haven't mostly read. And there's so many points in the book where I'm experiencing something that doesn't feel real to me um because it doesn't deserve to be in a book, like because it's maybe half formed or it's not dramatic enough. And I was constantly holding myself to the standards of like what would be fit to go in a book of any kind, um much less one by Toni Morrison, or even one by Margaret Weiss. Like there, I realized that a lot of this book is about having those narratives held up and thinking, well, I'm not living life right if it's not the stuff of that narrative.
Yeah, I think that I reading through this again was also having that same thought about, like, gosh, there really is so much about, like, there's so many instances of describing this feeling of, I was over here, this is the sort of real life was happening, and I was over here. Or, and some of those are narrated with hindsight. And then there are also moments that are, I think, kind of like symptomatic, where you don't quite feel comfortable, claiming without kind of qualifiers, or there's a certain amount of hedging. And I think the word that comes up a lot is drama. That, like, you don't want to be dramatic, or that your life is not dramatic enough. Like there's a funny quality to reading a book that is essentially saying, like, I'm sorry, this is about, like, my boring suicide attempt.
Yeah.
Like, because it, one, seems oxymoronic. Even though I think there's a reality to that. Like there is something about the, like, non-event that I think is important. But I if we're to think of it in kind of proper literary terms, the way that we might as first-year graduate students, like, something else that we might think about is just very simply, like, writing a memoir versus writing the tenure book, the academic book, versus also writing a novel. Because the thing that you tell us very briefly is that bibliophobia is actually, it sort of first comes to you as the kind of, haha, wouldn't it be funny to write a novel called Bibliophobia about some grad students who are terrified of books. And so that, the way that this book comes in at memoir is something that you can feel your anxiety, past and maybe present, but certainly past anxiety at like, we know this book we have at some point could have been a different book in a different genre, and it still is, there are still parts of it that are kind of have one foot in those worlds. And so it just seems like the whole book is really trying to figure out a relationship to genre.
Yeah, I was very reluctant for many years to write a memoir. And now that it's done, now that I've done it, I still have some of that reluctance, like that I'm still a little bit kind of like uncertain whether, the story of my boring suicide attempt is like enough of a story to be a book or to be any kind of book, no matter what the genre. And so it's sort of landed at memoir. I still sometimes I have to break myself with this habit, but I still have a kind of academic impulse to be like, it's not real. It says it's a memoir, but it's not real. It's a collection of essays. It's like a bunch of ideas, but I think I have to come to terms with the fact that it is a memoir and it is my life. Even if it seems not not like that sometimes to me. And I think that part of where that comes from is, well, part of it is academic and part of it is like is feelings kind of reverence for books that I've always felt like surely I could not deserve to be in a book, and like surely like if I'm writing a book about myself it must be folly and like hubris and whatever. But part of it I think is also depression and like thinking that depression sort of is a genre of experience, but also is marked by its non-genre, like it doesn't fit anywhere. It's not necessarily a kind of experience that you can put into a generic box. Like it there are aspects of it that there are so many different flavors of it that you can have all at once sometimes. And I think that part of not knowing how to define my experience comes from that, from not being able to say like it's a worthwhile experience because I didn't want to admit it to other people, or I when I did tell people about it, I didn't think that I thought that it made me less serious or like it made me less capable. Like all these things were told or were sort of that are kind of gestured to about depression, popular culture. Um, I think they all, those things like you're not whole until, especially in this country, like there's such a therapeutic attitude towards like improvement. Like if you have depression and you get better, then you deserve to write a book because you can have a narrative arc that ends in resolution. And if you have depression and you don't get better, you've like failed as an American person. You've like not succeeded in your narrative arc. And also like as a literary subject, you have nothing to say because you're still in the middle of this sort of non-event period, which, I think it's fine. It's obviously fine to be in that sort of non-narrative arc, but it can feel like so much more pressure to be like, well, I can't write anything until I get to the end, until I know what the end is going to be.
Yeah, it reminds me of uh I told you just before we got on that I had one of my life ruiners with us in the room tonight. And there is this line in Lauren Berlant's Cruel Optimism that is something like something like lives are not like novels, or maybe they are insofar as no one has ever actually accounted for everything in a novel, right? That partly it's about trying to say, let's stop treating, the way people actually live their lives as if they belonged in literary form. And then the other part is to say literary form, partly because it is a thing we do in our complicated human lives, can't even contain all of itself either.
Mhm. Right. It has a capaciousness that we did not intend for it to have sometimes. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. It's like Mary Poppins' carpet bag. There's no bottom. You think it's contained, but actually she pulls that lamp out.
It's true. And there's like there are these moments in the book where like sort of you in the real kind of pitch of depression are trying to insisting that it's a normal bag, in other words, right? Like saying uh, there's this real, that you're sort of teasing out this kind of analogy between this desire to like read a book but not identify with a character, to just be kind of like removed somewhere, like God,
Mhm.
says Flaubert. Um, and so that you can experience it but not be a part of it. But this is also this, you can also see in it very obviously the kind of like depressive narcissism of like, I am God and nobody, and I'm better and worse than everyone, and I
Right.
can't possibly be a part of this story.
And nobody can possibly comprehend me, capital M me, because, I'm too depressed. I'm too complex. Like no one has ever felt these feelings. And I think one thing that I found like very like a relief about being in the hospital and seeking treatment actually is being diagnosed and learning that I'm not so special. Like I'm not so complicated that no one can understand, my problems. Like they're actually very mundane. As is true of I think many of us, and we think that makes us worse, but actually there's something reassuring about it. It means you're not alone. It's like there is a sort of narcissism to that particular strand of aloneness where you're like, well, no one can comprehend, not true.
Yeah. Not true. And I mean, I also have that experience with a diagnosis, and it makes me wonder if there's something kind of like de-fictionalizing a little bit about the diagnosis. It is sort of like yanking you out of the narrative and being like, okay, like here's what's wrong with you. And it's like it's a thing that is a limited and sort of knowable to at least some extent. Um, but that is connected to I think, sort of the memoir question of like, not that this book was meant to be a novel, and not that you won't write a novel, because I am sure that you will, and I very much look forward to it and to all of the dragons in it. But but there is something about like stopping the aspiration to sort of like novelness,
Hmm.
being like, actually, I'm just a memoir, you know?
Yeah, I think that, when you set the diagnosis sort of yanks you out of one narrative, that might be the novelistic or whatever. It occurred to me that that ties back to your interest in genre. Like it yanks you from one narrative to another. Like it takes you from the bell jar to the DSM or whatever. It takes you from one place to another, and another in which you can sort of see the outlines of it, like the rules of that genre, even if they're often, as the DSM is often wrong and incorrect and harmful sometimes, they're there, right? The guidelines are there, and you can see. I remember feeling this profound feeling of recognition the first time I read some of the definitions or some of the diagnoses that I've been given, because I was like, well, some of this is not right, but some of it is like weirdly right. And they were feelings that I never thought to myself consciously before, but I realized when I was reading them that I'd been feeling them for a really long time. Um, and I think that there's something in the move itself, in like being jarred in that way, that many things can do to you. You know, life, that's what the life runner does. Like it does this sort of jarring where it shakes up what you believe in the world. And, you know, diagnosis can do it, or life events can do it. Like it takes some kind of upheaval to, even if it's only internal, to move from one genre of experience to another. You know, so I might have been thinking I would write a campus novel and ended up in memoir, but like perhaps I needed to end up there, even though if I was kicking and screaming and didn't want to do it, like maybe that's where I've come to realize that's where I had to be. You know, there's a part where I talk about Jeff Dyer Jeff Dyer's book Out of Sheer Rage, which is one of my favorite books. I think it's really exceptional. And he talks about the whole premise of the book is that he's going to write a very serious academic book about Dylan Thomas, and it's going to solve all of his, or about sorry, about D.H. Lawrence. It's going to solve, yes. Both of these men would be very bad for solving one's life, but he's going to write a serious book about Lawrence, and it's going to solve all of his problems, and people will take him seriously, and he'll take himself seriously, and whatever. But then it's only at the end, after like many convolutions and like trying to write the book and failing and like accidentally leaving all of his research in one place and going to another, whatever, like traveling, that he realizes that he had to write a book about himself. Like he had to write a book about despair, about depression, before he would ever even be able to start writing the Lawrence book. And it's interesting because it makes you reread everything that went before once it's put into another context. Like once you realize that it's his, that all of these kind of like, you know, divergent paths he's been on, these little digressions he's taking, these travels and adventures and car accidents and his romantic relationship, all that stuff is in the service explaining to us slowly that he is too like full of stuff. Like he's too full of problems to get down to writing this long essay about D.H. Lawrence. And it's just like a really it's an incredible moment because he enacts that kind of jarring for us, and in his own, like in this realization that he had been writing about his own inability to write about Lawrence for 200 pages. That, you know, I think whatever it is, like whether you are trying to write a monograph about Lawrence or you're trying to write a novel about dragons or like whatever you're trying to write, sometimes we need to be shaken up, and like we need something to take us out of that book to show us what we have to write to be able to go on to, you know, own up for ourselves, to see things clearly.
Yeah. And a recurring kind of fear in the book that appears to have been with you from a very young age is the idea that kind of outside of the book is just like a, you know, sea of death, basically, right? That when your book is over, you will be dead, or if you finish the book, then you will die. And obviously everyone in the book dies because the book is over, so you have to read the book again to bring them back to life and then kill them again. And that there is this, you know, real persistent idea about, you know, that, you know, like the book is in the sight of God and everything else is just, you know, sort of wasteland. And what you're saying now about, you know, moving from one genre into another is a really nice and kind of nicely deflating way of thinking about like where you might go if you were to leave a book. Like we actually know the answer. Like it's behind you and it's behind me, right? Like it's literally just another book, right? Like that the idea, and from the perspective of the characters in the first book, or the people or the ideas, whatever, that might be completely incomprehensible.
Right, it's another world, right? It's an unthought of world where you thought there's nothing, there's actually something that you could not have conceived of before. Yeah.
And because they need that, right? Like the DSM the DSM is a series of conclusions based on a series of assumptions, right? If the assumptions are bad or the conclusions aren't useful, then you got to find, a different ship, basically. But if you didn't make any assumptions, then it would just be a complete waste of time. So, if you've been going by the DSM all your whole life, and then you're like, okay, maybe I need an I Ching reading, or you've been going, or you're crazy and you've been going by the I Ching your whole life, and then maybe you need the DSM. Like, there's something about just moving from one. It's possible for a person to move from between two mutually incomprehensible things. You say at one point, oh, well, that's what you get for playing Eastern mysticisms off of each other. But that kind of is like, it seems like that's kind of the point. I mean, it's a little bit why the I Ching is there at the end of the book is to come in and be like, I'm the oldest book, everyone. Like, let me tell you
I know
what
everything.
I know. I comprehend all. Um, and then withholds in its sort of I Ching way. But so yeah, it was making me think about like there's this it's not an appendix because it's at the front, but there is a list of all of the cited works, unusually placed before the text. Usually you don't expect this after in your book. And it was just making me think of all of them sitting there with each other and having to sit there on the page, sometimes kind of uncomfortably because of, there's
No,
genre.
some don't like their neighbors.
No, they don't. And that's so, bibliophobia is also like when a book doesn't like another book, which it seems like could happen, or when a book likes a book, or like just thinking about, I know that all the books behind you are alphabetized and like they want to be in a particular place, right? There's this way they have relationships to each other. And kind of that's where you've ended up.
Maybe there's a way they'd prefer to be arranged other than alphabetically. I think that's a great observation, and that's very in tune with how I think about books in this book and in life. Um, people always ask me like, well, we've talked a little bit about identification and my problems identifying with characters, but I do identify very strongly with books themselves, with like whole texts. And so, or with whole writers over it sometimes, like Irish Murdoch or someone like that, where I'm like, well, I feel like the kind of book that Murdoch wrote is the kind of book that I like. I think that there's, I feel much more like instead of identifying with characters, I really feel like I get to know the books themselves, like as a whole. Like they are their own characters and they're speaking to each other or to me or to you or to whatever they're saying different things to all of us. And there's something in that conversation that books have with us that I find like endlessly exciting. I will say that I put the appendix, the text in order of appearance at the beginning of the book because I was thinking of it like a movie, like the cast of characters is at the beginning. You got a credit sequence. I also, I work on film and teach film and it helped me think about sort of book. It made it a little less scary to think of these books being with me.
Mm.
Like I sort of enlisted them into this project, like even if they don't want to do it necessarily. So like they all had to be in this movie. They are as much characters as like the people like Becker, like Merveille, whoever who's in this book. They're as much characters and people in my life. Um, yeah, I'll say one last thing that you made me think of when you were just talking was that this is this sort of need to jump genres to like explore different genres is like another argument for this is very pedagogical and this is the last thing I'll say on this topic, but it's like very it's in my nature to be pedagogical. I'm still a teacher. Um, it's an argument for diversifying your diet, for meeting different kinds of books or meeting different kinds of people, and for being expansive in your reading and reading things that challenge you or you think you don't like. Maybe you will like them, or maybe they will change you in some way, even if it's not pleasant. It might, like the books Having Neighbors they don't like, it might do something to you too.
Well, yeah, and it seems like it's also on the personal level a matter of like having other places to go than the one that you feel like you are in. That, that trapped feeling of depression that is, both sort of infinite and very narrow. Like there's all this stuff in the book about like, when you're going to die or how you're going to die, and are you going to do it, or, and will it be sort of cathartic or dramatic, or, how will it, and the it makes me think of that the book is sort of about like, how to survive your own death in a way. And kind of what we're saying is that like one of the ways you can do that is by just like putting down that book and starting another book. And, you can sort of effectively like fake your own death from one world and go into another.
Mm.
And I mean, it's also like what this actual book is. Like you have you have successfully faked your own death. I hope that it feels that way.
That makes me feel much more like a cool criminal than
None of us know where you are.
it's true, I could be anywhere.
You're
Um,
incognito, you're on the lam.
yeah, I think that's a beautiful idea. I think that's really optimistic that like I mean the phrases we use in the tritest way to describe this kind of thing are like that, like you turn over a new page when something happens to you. You like turn over a new leaf, whatever. I like the idea that you can always put one book down and start another one. Like it's always available to you. There's something very optimistic about that. If you're not happy with how this book is going, and it's something that I still have problems with as an actual reader. Like I am a real completist, and I have difficulty like putting a book down and starting another one. But maybe I should do that more. I don't know.
Well, on that note, maybe we should turn to some questions.
Yeah, we got quite a bit here. So let's go to the top of the queue. So Melanie asks, are there any other life ruiners in your life that you didn't mention in Bibliophobia and that you wish you had?
Oh gosh, there are so many. Well, I didn't write about Ferrante because my first co-authored book is about Elena Ferrante. But like many people, I felt like she came along and ruined my life many times. The book that I would have written about by her is Days of Abandonment, which I think is it's very short, but it's still one of the most devastating books I've ever read, and just really made me feel like the world was kind of ending there. When I finished it, I was like, this is incredible. Like uh, it was not like anything I'd read before, and it made me feel things that I'd not felt reading. So there's that one. There's actually a chapter of Bibliophobia that was the first chapter that I wrote that was going to be, for a while it hung on. It kind of like hung on there as a prologue to the book, and then at the end we're like, well, this has no place. But I did write about a number of other books in it that I wish I'd gotten to share. One of them was Deborah Levy's um trio of I think she calls the working or living autobiographies. The Cost of Living especially is the one that stuck out of me. And it's one of the books that inspired me to think that I could write this book. So I wanted that one to be in there. Didn't make it. Another is What Are You Going Through by Sigrid Nunez. Well, Nunez does make it into the end. kind of like she's the what I think of as the postgraph to this book. At the very, very end, for those of you who make it, there's an epigraph by Maya at the beginning and a postgraph by Nunez at the end. So there's that. And the third book that didn't make it in, that was informing the whole thing, is If Found on Richest Night, A Traveler by Italo Calvino, which has been a very important book to me for a very long time, as I think it is, I imagine it is for a lot of you. It's beautiful and funny and wonderful and magical, and it makes you wonder about reading, right? It's this sort of book that makes you the main. It's written in the second person, or it's addressed towards a character named you. So it makes you wonder why we read, why we're engaged in this like endless pursuit that is frustrating, but also we can't stop it.
Adam comments, I kept thinking of Walter Benjamin's 1931 text, Unpacking My Library, while reading your wonderful book. You both engage with books as near magical objects, as talismans, quote unquote, full of memory. Can you say a little bit about that overlap and the more general connections between bibliophobia and social theory?
That's a good question. I feel like I may not be able to clearly connect bibliophobia to social theory. But I will say that Benjamin is a figure who's sort of in the back of my mind a lot for some obvious reasons, who stays with me. And I think that there's something, I have an interesting relationship to that essay, because in some ways it's the opposite of what I'm doing, in that Benjamin was a famous bibliophile and loved his books and loved collecting things and loved objects in this sort of erratic way. And part of writing this book was my desire to sort of shake up that relation of like loving books that we have, that's so simplistically talked about in the media so much as like an unadulterated good thing. Like, we love books and it makes us better, it makes us like good people. And I think just loving books in that way doesn't necessarily, because you do more than just love them, and they do more than love you back, right? Sometimes they are uncomfortable or scary, and then sometimes a talisman is uncomfortable or scary. And so when I was thinking about Benjamin, that essay has always kind of eaten away at me, because I'm not sure how I relate to it. But the Benjamin that I do think about very closely in relation to what this book is doing is the storyteller. And the famous quote from that essay is that the storyteller draws authority from death, and always draws closer to the flame of life, but like we know that the flame of life will go out, and there's something about knowing that that makes stories sort of more powerful. And I think that that it's that relation that sort of speaks to me most clearly, more clearly in my mind than on Unpacking My Library, because I think I have complicated feelings about books. Like, I do think they're magical, and you can see all of my books back there, like I invest great power in them. And yet, as I say in the essay or in the book, I think several times, like bibliophilia and bibliophobia are two sides of the same coin for me. Like, they're very intertwined. And so every time I find myself sort of trusting too much in books or loving books too much, I get a little nervous about what they might do. Like, what, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Laura Bird comments, my 6-year-old Will has a question. How long did it take you to write your book?
I will. It took me, let's see, I started the book in 2020 probably, and I finished it in 2024. So it took me 4 years, kind of on and off writing it as different things for a little while. And, at first it was just an essay, which Andrea read, and then it was a couple of essays, which many people who are here tonight have read. And then I was like, well, I guess I'm writing a book. So it was a slow build up, but then, yeah, 4 years altogether, probably.
Cool. And we have Namwali Serpell in the room. Woohoo! Regarding whole books, are there any books that you haven't read or only half read or read so long ago that you don't remember or refuse to reread for which you have this kind of tangle of feeling?
Hi, Namali. I probably never admitted this out loud to anyone. I never finished reading Proust. And yet I have this very strong, so my first year of grad school, before I met Namali, some friends and I thought that we would read Proust over the summer. We were all going to different places and we're going to have a blog and it was a sort of first version of what I ended up doing with friends in the Fronte book, but we were going to have a blog and write to each other about Proust for summer and finish all the books, and it would be so wonderful. And it was killing two birds with one stone because it was like very serious and helpful, but also it would be fun. But we did not make it past the first book, if that. And yet still I grew sort of I felt kind of guilty for lagging my reading. I really wanted to do it, but I was just, my first year of grad school, like feeling very burnt out, feeling tired. And so I started writing these letters in the voice of a sort of caricature of Marcel Proust, where I would not write any blog entries, but Marcel would occasionally. It was as though he had like woken up in like 2007 Berkeley and was like, hello, I'm going to do all these things. I'm going to get, so that character is still in my head. Like he's still with me, even though I have not ever finished the book itself.
Merv comments, more of a comment than a question. Great lip color. And then I think Adam added something. What is the political content of Bibliophobia? What is the role of capital in your text?
Big question. Gosh, big questions from Adam. I think the political, I've been thinking about I've been thinking about book banning, and I did not realize when I started writing this sort of personal set of essays or whatever was about books, like coming from this very academic place, that it would have like a weird relevance to the moment that we're all living through. We're living in a moment where people want to limit the ideas or want to limit our interaction with the ideas that we meet in the world, and want to, this age of sort of new age of book banning is one where we want to keep children safe by just having them read things that are nice and good and safe and not going to challenge anything. And I think there's something very important in being challenged by books, being able to have the freedom to encounter books that that you don't want to encounter sometimes, or that might make you uncomfortable or might make you see things differently. Like I think that we should be encouraging children to ruin their lives with reading rather than trying to coddle them and keep them safe. And I think that, this moment of like trying to control so strongly like what kids are exposed to, or what people, not just children, like people in general in this country are exposed to, is one in which we should be reaching for books that make us uncomfortable and that we're not familiar with, and that that we're not always going to understand the first time. We should be going towards those books rather than away from them. With regards to capital, that's actually a good question. I am reevaluating my stance towards reading as someone who was a kind of professional reader before and read in this very intentional, instrumentalized way. I read to produce when I was an academic, and I'm trying to work out what it means to not to read that way anymore and to encounter cultural objects in a way that is not just like I've read this, so I have to write something about it so it counts, so it can feed into this kind of, academic machine. Instead, I want to get back to some sense of just reading things kind of as they come, like a person, not like an academic robot. And I'm still working on that. I'm still working on what that will mean for me professionally, like what it means to be a freelance writer, which is not something I totally get yet. Yeah, I could, I could talk about this for a long time because it's very confusing to me, but I'm thinking about it.
Mike asks, at what point do you know a book is going to be a life ruiner?
Well, it's funny, at one of the book events that I had in person here, someone asked me if I had ever had a book that started not as a life ruiner, that became a life ruiner. And I talked for a really long time, probably too long, about Madame Bovary, which I love, but I really, really love it. But I did not love it the first time I read it. And so I read it because I was a French major in college, so I had to read it a lot. And I read it at least twice, being like, this is so boring. I don't like it. I don't enjoy this. And then something happened, and I started to enjoy it more, like enjoy Flaubert's prose more and enjoy what the book was doing more. And so in that case, like it took reading the whole thing more than once and not knowing that would be a life ruiner, and then reading it again and being like, wow, how did I not see this before? This has changed everything for me. But sometimes, on the first page, I was writing about Morrison again for Bibliophobia. I opened it and she starts it with an epigraph from a Dick and Jane primer, where I'm sure lots of people are familiar with this page. I had forgotten about it from when I was 16, when I came back to it. But she starts with Dick and Jane live in a white and green house with a red door, blah, blah. And then she repeats that section of the Dick and Jane primer without spaces in the words. So it's this kind of this speeding up, this like kind of hectic pace comes into it, where you're like, well, I thought I knew what this was. And then she repeats the third time without spaces between the words. So it's just this unbroken, like what looked like the most anodyne, the most simplistic thing 1 second ago was all of a sudden this like dizzying array where you just could not focus. And when I looked at that book again, I just, from that page, I was like, this is as good as I remember. This is crazy. Like that's, it made me feel dizzy just looking at it.
So Janet Kwan asks, this is a very deep question. If you were to marry a cheese, what cheese would you marry? Thank you.
Oh, this is an inside joke, but also a good question for anyone. And I highly advise people to use it as an icebreaker. If there's nothing else to talk about, you can always ask what cheese you'd marry. It often changes, but I think the last time I talked about this at length, which was to Andrea, I said that it was fresh mozzarella. And we came up with a whole backstory to fresh mozzarella and his relatives, his big Italian family, his sort of godfather's smoked mozzarella, scamorza. There's the whole family.
And then Jared Olmsted says, Sarah, you are the most loved life ruiner of them all. when is your book on karaoke coming out?
I mean, I hope someday. I don't know. We need to, Jared, we need to do karaoke so I can have more inspiration for this future book, which hopefully will also be the book with dragons that Andrew wants me to write.
Well, we have come to the top of the hour, and I really want to thank you both. We've had such a great time and really appreciate gracing our halls. Sarah Chihaya, congratulations on a really wonderful book. And Andrea Long Chu, thank you for doing the honors. Really great conversation. And thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us. Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our publishing program, and our educational outreach. And it's all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So take care, everyone. Be well, stay strong. We hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you, everyone. Go to City Lights, one of the greatest bookstores in the world.
It's been so much fun. Thank you both. That was great.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.